In 2019, 80 years after the Second World War had begun in Europe, a dark chapter of Nazi history inside of Berlin was revisited. Police officials in the city reported that the grave of one of the most evil Nazis was disturbed, and there had been an attempt to break into the grave of Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich had the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people on his hands during World War II, and he was someone who chaired the very conference that saw the final solution planned. Heydrich was by all accounts a disturbing and very dark man, who ruthlessly wanted to slaughter as many people as he could under the persecuting laws of the Third Reich. But following his assassination in 1942, it was a rather open secret where Heydrich had been buried. His grave marker had been removed, but why did the grave get broken into? There are many theories, but it was obvious that the people who did this, who have still yet to have been located, it's believed, were looking for something. Heydrich would have been buried in his SS uniform, and he would have had on him a number of high-ranking artefacts, which today could be worth millions if they ever came onto the market. One possible item is that the grave robbers were looking for the sword of Reinhard Heydrich, his ceremonial officer's SS sword. But what happened to this, and was he really buried with it? Welcome to the Untold Past. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Heydrich developed the nickname of the Blonde Beast for a reason. He was seen in the eyes of Hitler and Himmler as the ideal Aryan man, and he rose to the position of the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, overseeing the Gestapo, SD and Kripo. He had a huge amount of power within Nazi Germany, and he later became the protector of Bohemia and Moravia. He was in this role tasked with keeping the Czechs under submission, as they were involved in arming the German army, and these regions were seen as weapons factories of the Reich. To do this, Heydrich brought in a reign of terror in which people were executed in public, hanged from lampposts and made to disappear, all to keep the Czechs in line and on their toes. To get involved in resistance and found out was a death sentence, and Heydrich needed the region to be as productive as it could. But there was a lot of resistance underground, and British-trained SOE agents would carry out his assassination in Prague in 1942. He was attacked as his car, his convertible Mercedes, passed by two assassins, Joseph Gabschik and Jan Kubis, but Heydrich, despite having a bomb thrown at the car and being seriously wounded, did try to fight on. He later succumbed to his injuries, and it was confirmed that he died from sepsis and blood poisoning, which was suspicious in itself, after it was noted that Heydrich was seen to be recovering. One last visit to Himmler marked him falling into a coma, and then dying on the 4th of June 1942. Now the 38-year-old Heydrich had a number of different funerals. The first funeral of Heydrich occurred inside of Prague, the very city where he had been killed, before his body inside of the coffin was then placed on board a train to be transported back to Berlin, where a huge state funeral and occasion would take place. This was a colossal Nazi gathering and spectacle, full of all the pomp and ceremony which would be expected, and Hitler was also in attendance. Himmler gave the long and lengthy eulogy and welcomed people to the service and ceremony, and Heydrich's coffin was draped in large Nazi swastika flags and was carried by senior members of the SS. Flowers surrounded the coffin as it was placed on the plinth, and the funeral began, and many SS banners also decorated the Reich Chancellery building where the funeral did take place. Hitler's role in the ceremony was significant, and the Führer placed Heydrich's decorations, including the highest grade of the German Order and the prestigious Blood Order medal, on his funeral pillow. Himmler ended the ceremony by saying, and I quote, "But it is our holy duty to atone for his death, to take up his tasks, and to pitilessly destroy without any sign of weakness the enemies of our people. I have one last thing to say. You, Reinhard Heydrich, SS, were truly a good one. On a more personal level, I thank you for your unwavering loyalty and wonderful friendship, which united us in life, and death cannot obliterate it." Following this, the body of Heydrich in the coffin was then taken to the Invalidenfriedhof inside of Berlin, a military cemetery which had a long history of housing the remains of high-ranking German military heroes and veterans. Heydrich by many was seen in this shocking light, and he was buried inside of Section A in the cemetery, and his grave was marked with an iron cross containing his name. Now it was no secret where Heydrich was buried, and he was interred in a grave near to a north wall of the cemetery at the front, and Hitler then later commissioned a number of monumental sculptures and objects along with a huge tomb for Heydrich. But as the war turned against the Germans, this tomb was never finished and completed, and Heydrich's grave marker was later removed and destroyed. One thing to consider is that even in the decades after the deaths of high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, some figures were exhumed and their remains dealt with once and for all. Rudolf Hess, following his death decades after the war, was buried in different locations, but his body was then dug up and cremated due to unwanted activity inside the cemetery due to neo-Nazi groups. This was never the case with Reinhard Heydrich, a man whose role inside the SS led to the direct slaughter and deaths of so many people, and inside of the Berlin cemetery, Heydrich's remains were left for some time. But then in December 2019, the shocking story of the attempted break-in to his grave was reported under the cover of darkness. It was a local council employee who discovered the attempted break-in into the burial, and no motive for this has ever been uncovered. It was confirmed that no remains were taken, but it was certain that someone may have been looking for something. Heydrich, without doubt, following his death would have been dressed inside of his coffin in his full SS uniform, and he possibly could have been wearing some of his medals on his uniform. He was a man who prided himself on his appearance, and was rarely seen out of SS uniform in the final months of his life. The attire of course included a number of things, including his hat, which was probably also buried with him, but also a weapon which, despite being ceremonial, would have been something, if desperate, he could have used to fight off his attackers. Heydrich's SS Honor Sword today would be worth millions of pounds if it emerged on the market for purchase. Such a weapon with a link to a high-ranking Nazi would disturbingly be worth a small fortune. The SS Degen, as it was known, was a dress sword worn with an SS uniform from 1935 until the end of the war. Himmler's advisor on art designed it, and Himmler wanted all high-ranking SS members to have one. The sword itself has a thin, straight blade of different length based on the height of the owner, and the hilt has a D-shaped knuckle bow and a black wooden grip. Also around the grip was silver wire and SS lightning bolt runes, and further decoration is found around the weapon. The officer's sword was given out to selected SS members for a special merit, and Himmler himself awarded these with a hand-signed certificate. Officers who also graduated from SS officer training centres were given one. The sword was worn at official functions and visits, and Heydrich is seen in a number of pictures with this on his side. Could it be that those who broke into the grave of Heydrich were looking for his sword? It's likely that they wanted to loot a number of other objects, or even worse, steal the bones of Heydrich and use them for some sort of relic. But one thing to consider is the SS rituals that happened following the death of a member who was high-ranking. There was a custom for SS officers to be buried with a sword, however this may have not been the sword of the deceased, as one writer claimed that the man closest to the deceased in terms of rank and relationship, or friendship, would exchange the sword of the dead officer for his own. This, if we equate it to Reinhard Heydrich's standing in the SS, would mean that it would be someone like Himmler himself, who was great friends with the Blonde Beast, who could have exchanged his sword, or someone like Heinrich Müller, the director of the Gestapo, who was preceded by Heydrich in the job, may have swapped swords. If Müller or Himmler did exchange their weapons with the dead Heydrich, then this is what would be buried inside of the coffin, and it's likely, if this was an SS custom or tradition, then this would not have stopped with someone so high status, and this would have been observed. Himmler, let's remember, was a man who was obsessed with tradition, the occult, and ensuring his SS maintained rules and regulations important to him. But this would then lead to the conclusion that Himmler or Gestapo Müller's sword is the one that is inside the coffin. It is possible that other items wanted to be looted from Heydrich's grave, and there are accounts following World War II of all manner of strange behaviour occurring with the remains of high-profile Nazis or collaborators. For example, Benito Mussolini's decaying corpse following the posthumous display of his body was buried and then exhumed, with his body then being stolen. Thieves removed part of his leg, and still today this has not been located, and it's believed he is buried inside his tomb with one leg missing. The thieves who broke into the grave did not take anything it's recorded, meaning that for this to be confirmed, there must have been some form of inspection of the remains of Heydrich to say otherwise. What is concerning, though, is the media attention brought to the grave robbing attempt that did occur. It was now no secret where one of the most brutal and sadistic Nazi mass murderers was buried, and this was then told to the world. His sword, or someone's sword, it's almost certain, is still inside of the coffin, along with probably some of his decorations and medals. It is strange, though, how there has been no attempt to exhume the remains of Heydrich by German government officials and deal with them once and for all, like with what happened to Rudolf Hess. This would have been a way for authorities to put Heydrich's actions behind them and to prevent any future activity occurring involving his gravesite. Maybe it is because of what's inside the coffin that does prevent this, as his funeral was one of the largest Nazi spectacles and shows of strength during the war years within Germany. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.